My mom hired a lawyer to take Grandma's 2.5 Mellers from me. She didn't know about the video. My name is Claire Sutton. I'm 26 years old. I work as a pediatric nurse at a community hospital in rural Tennessee, which means I have held the hands of strangers on the worst days of their lives and kept my face calm while doing it. I learned that from my grandmother. Her name was Dorothy Sutton. Everyone called her Dot. She was 84 years old when she died, 4 feet 11 inches tall, and the single most precise, deliberate, and formidable person I have ever known. She left me $2.5 million. She left my mother nothing. 3 weeks after the funeral, my mother hired an attorney. The lawsuit alleged that I had exercised undue influence over an elderly woman with diminished capacity, manipulated her into changing a previous will, and fraudulently obtained an inheritance that rightfully belonged to her only surviving child, my mother. The case went on for 14 months. Then, on a Thursday morning in a wood-paneled conference room in downtown Nashville, my grandmother's attorney opened a laptop, pressed play on a video file, and my mother's attorney asked for a recess before the 4th minute was done. The case was dropped the following Monday. My mother has not spoken to me since. I want to tell you about the video. But first I need to tell you about Dot, because without Dot, none of this makes any sense. Stay with me. Subscribe. The video comes later, and when I tell you what was on it, you will understand everything. My grandmother, Dorothy Sutton, was born in 1938 in a 2-room house in Harlan County, Kentucky, to a coal miner and a seamstress who between them owned 4 things of value: a Bible, a cast-iron skillet, a 1932 Singer sewing machine, and the absolute unshakable conviction that education was the one thing nobody could take from you once you had it. Got it. She was the first person in her family finish high school. She put herself through 2 years of secretarial college working nights at a diner. She moved to Nashville at 22 with $40 and a suitcase and talked her way into a job at an accounting firm that had never hired a woman for anything above receptionist. By the time she was 35, she owned a piece of that firm. By the time she was 50, she owned it entirely. By the time she retired at 68, she had built it into one of the most respected small accounting practices in the state of Tennessee, sold it for more money than anyone in Harlan County had ever seen in one place, and moved into a white house on a hill outside Nashville with a garden and a porch and a view of the valley that she described every single time as the thing she had worked her whole life to see. She was not flashy about the money. She drove a 2009 Buick LeSabre that she refused to replace because it had never given her trouble and she saw no reason to spend money on a problem she didn't have. She wore the same pearl earrings every day for 40 years. She kept her checkbook balanced to the penny. She was not a soft woman. She was a precise one, and she loved me in the particular way that precise people love, not loudly, not demonstratively, but with complete accuracy. She saw me clearly. She always had. My mother. Susan is Dot's only child. I want to be fair to my mother because this is a complicated story, and she is a complicated person. She is not a villain. She is a woman who was raised by a formidable mother and spent her entire life both wanting her approval and resenting how hard it was to get. That is a painful thing to carry. I understand that now in a way I didn't at 19, but understanding someone's pain does not mean absorbing the consequences of how they aim it. My mother and Doth had a relationship that I can only describe as a long, unresolved argument that neither of them ever figured out how to end. They loved each other. They also spent decades unable to be in the same room for more than an hour without the why. Temperature dropping 3 degrees. My mother wanted Dot to be warmer. Dot wanted my mother to be tougher. Neither of them ever got exactly what they wanted, and somewhere in that gap, I became the person both of them could actually talk to, not because I was special, because I was willing to listen without needing anything back. I had been doing it since I was 7. Comment the word dotif. You have ever been the person in your family who keeps the peace not because you're asked to, but because you're the only one who can stand the quiet long enough to sit in it. Stay close. The will was changed 3 years before Dot died. I need to tell you why. Subscribe so it doesn't slip past you. I was 19 when my grandmother was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. Not terminal. Not immediately, but serious, the kind of diagnosis that reorganizes a person's relationship with time. Dot was 80. She had been living alone in the White House on the Hill since my grandfather passed in 2009. She managed everything. Herself, the garden, the finances, the house, the appointments. She was sharper at 80 than most people I know at 40. But the diagnosis changed things. My mother's response too. Dot's diagnosis was to increase the number of phone calls and decrease the number of visits. I understand that. 2. Fear makes people strange. Some people move toward the thing they're scared of. Some people create distance and call it composure. My mother called twice a week. From Atlanta, where she lived with my stepfather, and visited at Thanksgiving and sometimes Easter. I drove up every weekend. Not because anyone asked me to. Not because I expected anything. Because Dot was 80 and sick and she had a garden that needed tending and a porch that needed company, and she was the person who had read to me every Friday night of my childhood when my mother worked late. And sitting with her on that porch in the Tennessee evening was the most honest place I knew how to be. We talked about everything. Her childhood in Harlan County, the accounting firm, my grandfather, who she missed with a precision and consistency that I found quietly extraordinary. Nursing school, which I had just started. The patients I was learning to care for. What it meant to be present for someone else's worst moment. She told me once, on a Sunday evening in October when the valley was turning gold below us, Claire, most people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen by someone they're also afraid of disappointing. Don't do that. See yourself first, then let people meet who you actually are. I was 20 years old. Wrote it down when I got home. I still have it. It was during this period, between my first and second year of nursing school, that Dot changed her will. I did not ask her to. I did not know she had until 6 months later when she told me herself. On a morning when we were in the garden, and she was showing me how to cut back the rose cannas so they would come back stronger. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without ceremony. I've updated my estate documents. Gerald has the copies. I want you to know what's in them so you're not surprised later. I said, Grandma, you don't have to. She said, I know I don't have to. I'm telling you because I want to. Don't interrupt. So I didn't. She told me about the will. She told me about the accounts. She told me the reasons, not defensively, not emotionally, but the way she would have explained. Financial decision to a client. Clear, precise, documented. Your mother has been well provided for her entire adult life, she said. She has a husband with a good income, a paid house, and more financial security than I had at 40. She does not need this money. She would spend it carelessly and feel guilty about it afterward. She paused, looked at the rose canes. You, on the other hand, are 20 years old and becoming someone I recognize. I didn't know what to say. She said, You're going to help people for a living and not get paid nearly enough for it. I want you to have options. I want the money to go somewhere that it will mean something. Then she handed me the pruning shears and told me to watch my fingers. That was the whole conversation. I went home and I did not tell anyone, not my mother, not my friends, not anyone. Dot had told me in confidence and I treated it that way. 6 months later, she called Gerald, her attorney, and had the documents properly filed. 2 witnesses present, notarized, recorded. Gerald told me later that in 31 years of estate law, he had rarely seen a client more certain about a decision. She came in with notes, he said. 3 pages of typed notes explaining her rationale. She didn't want there to be any question about her clarity of mind. There was a reason for the notes. Dot knew my mother. She knew what was coming. Dot passed on a February morning, 4 years after the diagnosis. She went quietly, at home, in the White House on the Hill, with the valley visible from her window, and her pearl earrings on because she had put them on that morning the way she always did, deliberately, precisely as if it were any other day. I was there. I had driven up the night before because something told me to. The specific, quiet knowing that nursing teaches you when a person is close to the end, not fear, not urgency, just the recognition that presence is the only thing left to give. I sat with her through the night. In the morning, she looked at me once clearly with the eyes that had always seen me, and then she was gone. I called my mother. My mother drove up from Atlanta. She arrived 4 hours later. She did not ask how. Dot had been in her last hours. She did not ask if I was all right. The first thing she said, standing in Dot's kitchen, was, "Has Gerald been contacted?" I said yes. She said, "When do we meet with him?" I said, "He'll call us." She nodded and walked into the living room to start making phone calls. I stood in Dot's kitchen with the smell of her coffee still in the air, and I understood, in one clear, quiet moment, that the next few months were not going to be simple. Gerald called 3 days later. He asked us to come to his office together. My mother wore a blazer. She brought a notepad. She sat across from Gerald's desk, like a woman who has already done the math and is here to confirm it. Gerald read the will. My mother's pen stopped moving on the third paragraph. By the end, the notepad was closed. The room was very quiet. Gerald asked if there were questions. My mother said, in a voice I had never heard before, very flat, very controlled, the voice of someone deciding something in real time, "I want to contest it." Gerald said, "That is your right." She looked at me. I looked back. Neither of us said anything. We drove back to Dot's house in separate cars. 3 weeks later, I received a legal notice from an attorney in Atlanta. The lawsuit alleged undue influence, diminished capacity, and fraudulent manipulation of an elderly woman's estate. 14 months, Claire, and a video. Comment the word Gerald if you have ever sat in a lawyer's office and watched someone's face change when they heard something they had not prepared for. Subscribe. The video is coming, and I promise, you will not see it coming either. Here is what I want to tell you about the 14 months between the lawsuit and the Thursday morning in the conference room in Nashville. They were the hardest months of my life. Not because of the money. I want to be clear about that. I was 22 years old. I had grown up in a household where we were comfortable but not wealthy. $2.5 million was not a number I had any framework for. It did not feel real. It felt like a fact about someone else's life that had been handed to me accidentally. What made the 14 months hard was not the money. It was my mother saying, in a formal legal document, that I had manipulated the person I loved most in the world. That I had taken advantage of an old woman's deteriorating mind. That I had used my access to Dot, the weekends, the garden, the porch evenings, all of it, strategically. Calculatingly, for financial gain. I want you to sit with that, because those weekends, every single one of them, were the best hours of my life, not because of what I expected to receive, because of what I was given simply by being in her presence. Simply by being seen, and my mother had taken those hours and filed them in a court document as evidence of manipulation. I did not eat well for 3 months. I lost weight I didn't have to lose. I drove to Dot's White House and sat on the porch alone and talked to her the way you talk to someone who can no longer answer, and you do it anyway, because the alternative is silence you can't bear. My attorney's name was Patricia Moore. She was recommended by Gerald. She was 54 years old, had handled estate litigation for 26 years, and had the specific, grounded calm of someone who has seen every version of this story before and is not surprised by any of it. She reviewed the case on a Tuesday. She called me on Wednesday morning. "Claire," she said, "your grandmother was meticulous." "Yes." "Gerald tells me she came to him with 3 pages of typed notes." "Yes." "Is there anything else? Any documentation? Of her state of mind? Anything that shows her making clear, independent decisions in the period when the will was changed?" I thought for a moment. Then I said, "Patricia, I need to tell you about the video. Here is the video." In the last 4 years of Dot's life, she kept a small digital recorder on the desk in her study. She had started it, she told me once, because she was reading a book about memory and aging, and the author had suggested that people with early cognitive concerns might benefit from keeping a verbal journal, speaking their thoughts out loud as a way of tracking clarity over time. Dot did not have early cognitive concerns. She was as sharp as she had ever been, but she liked the idea of a record. She had been a bookkeeper before she was an accountant. She believed in documentation, the way other people believe in faith. She recorded herself approximately twice a week for 4 years. The recordings were not dramatic. They were Dot. She talked about the garden, about the patients I told her about, anonymously, always, about books she was reading, about my grandfather, about the valley. She talked about me. She talked about my mother. She talked about the will. Specifically, on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 months before, she called Gerald to file the documents. She sat at her desk and recorded herself for 22 minutes and 14 seconds. She described her decision in complete detail. Her reasoning, her love for my mother, and her honest assessment of her mother's relationship with money, her recognition that what she was doing was unusual, her anticipation that it would be contested. And then, because she was Dot, because she had been a bookkeeper, because she believed in documentation the way other people believe in faith, she looked directly at the recorder and she said, "I am Dorothy Ann Sutton. Today is October 14th. I am 81 years old. I am making this recording because I am aware that my decision regarding my estate may be questioned after my death by people who believe I lacked the capacity to make it clearly. I did not lack that capacity. I have never lacked that capacity. I have thought about this decision for 2 years. I have consulted with Gerald Foss, who has known me for 31 years, and who will confirm that I came to him with 3 pages of typed rationale. I am leaving my estate to my granddaughter Claire Elizabeth Sutton because she is the person who showed up. Not for what I had, for who I was. I know the difference. I have known it my whole life. A woman who built everything she owned from a 2-room house in Harlan County knows exactly the difference between someone who loves you and someone who loves what you represent. Claire loves me. I am certain of this in the way I am certain of a balanced ledger. This is my decision. It is clear. It is considered. It is final. And I am making this recording so that anyone who questions it will have to look me in the eye to do so. 22 minutes and 14 seconds. Gerald had the flash drive. He had known about it for 4 years. He had said nothing because Dot had told him to keep it until it was needed. She said you'd know when, he told me. He was right. The Thursday morning in Nashville. Patricia and I arrived early. My mother and her attorney were already seated on the other side of the conference table. My mother looked tired. She had aged in 14 months in the specific way that litigation ages people, not in lines and wrinkles, but in the eyes, in the way the eyes carry the weight of something that won't resolve. I looked at her and I felt something I had not expected to feel. I felt sad, not angry, not vindicated, not triumphant. Sad. Because the woman across the table was my mother, and she had spent 14 months and significant money trying to take something from method her own mother had spent 4 years carefully, deliberately making sure I would receive. Gerald sat at the head of the table. He opened his laptop. He placed the flash drive in the port. He said, "Before we begin today's proceedings, there is a piece of evidence I'd like to enter into the record. A recorded statement made by Dorothy Ann Sutton on October 14th, approximately 26 months before her death." My mother's attorney leaned forward. Gerald pressed play. Dot's voice filled the room. She was clear. She was precise. She was unmistakably, completely herself. At 3 minutes and 47 seconds, my mother's attorney raised his hand. "I'd like to request a brief recess." Gerald paused the recording. "Of course," Patricia said. The recess lasted 31 minutes. When my mother's attorney returned to the table, he sat down, opened his folder, looked at his client once, and then looked at Patricia. "We'd like to discuss settlement." Patricia said, "There is nothing to settle. The will stands as filed." A pause. "My client would like to withdraw the complaint." Patricia looked at me. I nodded once. "Accepted," she said. The following Monday, the case was formally withdrawn. No settlement. No negotiation. No money changed hands. Just a flash drive and 22 minutes and 14 seconds of a woman who had been a bookkeeper before she was an accountant and who believed in documentation the way other people believe in faith, and who had known, 4 years before her death, exactly what was coming and had quietly, precisely prepared for it anyway. Comment the word October if you have ever been defended by someone who is no longer here, someone who believed in you enough to leave proof. I want to know how many of us have been loved that carefully. Subscribe. The ending of this story is the part I think about most. Here is what happened after. My mother did not speak to meet the dismissal. She walked out of the conference room ahead of her attorney in the same blazer she had worn to Gerald's office 14 months earlier, and she did not look at me as she passed. I watched her go. I did not call after her. Patricia touched my arm gently and said, "Give her time." I said, "How much time?" Patricia thought about it. As much as she needs, and not 1 minute more. I drove back to the White House on the hill. I sat on the porch. The valley was the same view. Dot had described every time she saw it, the thing she had worked her whole life to see. I sat there for a long time in the November afternoon, and I talked to her the way I always did. The way you talk to someone when the talking is more for you than for them, when the words are not really words but a form of continuing to love someone past the point where love has anywhere left to go except into the air. I told her about the room, about the recess, about the 31 minutes, about my mother walking out. I told her the recording was perfect, that it was completely, exactly her, that Gerald had been right to keep it until it was needed. Then I sat quiet for a while and looked at the valley. Here is the thing about the money that I want to tell you honestly, because I think it matters. I have not spent it carelessly. I paid off my nursing school loans the week the case was dismissed. $67,000, gone in one phone call. The best phone call I have ever made. I bought a small house in the same county as the White House, not far from the hill, not far from the valley. I set up a scholarship fund at the nursing school in Dorothy Ann Sutton's name, for first-generation students who are working their way through. The way she worked her way through everything, by showing up, by keeping accurate records, and by refusing to believe that where you started had anything to do with where you were going. 3 students have received it so far. The first recipient, a 21-year-old from Eastern Kentucky, wrote me a letter after she was notified. She said she had never heard of Dorothy Sutton. She said she looked her up and read about Harlan County and the accounting firm and the 2009 Buick LeSabre and the pearl earrings. She said, I think she would have understood me. I wrote back and told her more than she knew. My mother called me 7 months after the dismissal. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was in the garden of the White House, cutting back the rose canes the way Dot had taught me, watching my fingers. My phone rang, my mother's name on the call screen. I looked at it for a moment. Then I answered Susan. Claire. A pause. Then she said, I heard the recording. I know. I mean all of it. Gerald sent me a copy after the dismissal. I stopped cutting. I listened to the whole thing, she said. 2 minutes. I waited. She talked about me. Yes. She said, her voice caught. She said she loved me at the end. She said she loved me, and she knew I would be angry, and she was sorry it had to be this way, but that she had spent their whole life being precise, and she wasn't going to stop at the most important thing she'd ever decide. I sat down on the garden step. I didn't know she said that. I told her. It's at the end, after the part Gerald played in the room. A long silence between us. Claire, my mother said finally, I don't know how to do this. I know. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know. She stopped. Mom? I said quietly. What? Do you want to come see the valley? A pause. Very long. Yes, she said. I think I do. She came the following Saturday. She drove up from Atlanta, the same way Dot had driven everything, without making a fuss about the distance. Made coffee. We sat on the porch. We looked at the valley together without saying very much, which is sometimes the only way to be in the same place at the same time with someone you have hurt and who has hurt you without the hurting being the whole of the story. My mother cried once, briefly, looking at the view. I handed her a dish towel because it was the closest thing. She laughed, a little through the crying, and that laugh, small, surprised, slightly reluctant, was the most my mother has ever sounded like Dot. I noticed it. I let it land. I did not say it out loud. Some things are better left as what they are. A moment on a porch, a valley below, 2 women trying to find their way back to something that was always there, just scattered. Welcome back to Lily Drama Stories. You just heard Claire Sutton's story, the granddaughter who drove up every weekend for 4 years, not for what Dot had, but for who she was and who found out, in a conference room in Nashville, that Dot had known the difference all along and had quietly, precisely documented it here, is the one thing I want you to take from this. Being present is not a strategy, it is the thing itself. Claire did not drive up every weekend because she expected to be in a will. She drove up because she loved her grandmother and because love, when it is real, does not require an audience or an outcome or a return. She just showed up week after week for 4 years, and her grandmother, a woman who had come from a 2-room house in Harlan County and built everything she owned from nothing, saw her doing it and documented it with the same care she had applied to everything else in her life. You cannot manufacture that. You cannot plan it. You can only be it quietly for as long as it takes, and trust that the people who love you clearly will recognize it for what it is. Dot recognized it. She always had. Drop a comment below. Tell me your word, Doughty, Gerald, or October, whichever one landed hardest. And if this story found you today, share it. Share it with someone who shows up without being asked, who sits on cold porches and tends other people's gardens and never expects anything back. They deserve to know that someone sees them. Subscribe. There are more stories. The women in them are waiting to be heard. I will see you in the next one.